really a pleasure to see you and to be with you for this very valuable conversation. How are you?
I'm fine, Marc. How are you? I'm also really happy to have this conversation.
Well, maybe just to begin, a bit of a personal history. It was probably over 25 years ago that I personally became more aware and more directly involved with the work of the SEATINI organization. At that time, there was a very interesting U.S. Africa trade policy related initiative called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that was being and was really being labeled as a transformative international trade framework that would change the very nature of U.S. Africa trade relations, but even more importantly, would really be a driving change for the role of international trade in supporting economic growth and development on the continent. And at that time, as an economist, I was somewhat critical of that narrative because some of the elements that I was seeing that were included in the framework in this AGOA initiative, to me, failed to really address the many fundamental structural issues that I have always felt have really hindered the ability of African economies to use trade as a tool to promote economic development. And that was, again, I think, for me, and to be able to work with SEATINI at that time to kind of share some of those critical perspectives was really helpful. So, with that bit of a backdrop, I know the organization is celebrating 30 years of supporting trade negotiations, trade policy formulation and development in the region. Take some time to first give us a bit of that history. Why was SEATINI organized and created? What was its mission, so to speak? And maybe that's a good place to start for those in the audience who are not familiar with that history. So thank you for that first point.
Okay, thank you so much, Marc. And thank you so much also for giving us that history about AGOA. In fact, in a way, it capsulizes what we do as SEATINI. But to go back to the question, why SEATINI was formed 30 years ago. SEATINI was formed during the first inaugural World Trade Organization ministerial meeting conference in Singapore. As you know, the World Trade Organization was formed in 1995. The Marrakesh Agreement was signed in Marrakesh in 1995. That was, I think, January. And in 1996, the first ministerial conference took place in Singapore. And the ministerial conference is the highest governance body of the World Trade Organization. So at that meeting in Singapore, a number of scholars from the global south realized that something was missing, something was wrong, because especially African negotiators and ministers would just go there, read their statements, and walk out, you know. So a number of scholars said, no, our people don't understand what they have signed into, you know. So because they didn't appreciate the fact that the WTO, when you sign on it, you have to change your laws back home. You know, that's what we call WTO plus. You have to go back, change your laws in line with the WTO, what you have agreed. They didn't know that when you are away, you are not there in the room to say no, it means you have said yes. So they didn't know, and this is what people like Professor Ashtandon, Martin Cole, Ragavan, Eric Reinhardt, a number of scholars, they were there. They knew that the WTO is another new animal altogether, and that our people, our policymakers, our negotiators have not yet understood that. So that was the beginning of SEATINI. And SEATINI was an idea. It was a very bold idea at a very critical moment in the global economic governance, because the WTO had expanded from the gut. It had expanded beyond tariffs, beyond issues around market access, to include issues around intellectual property, issues around services, issues around trade-related issues like investment, competition policy, trade facilitation, a bunch of other issues. So people like Yash said, no, we need to do something. Our policymakers, our negotiators need to understand that they have to negotiate. It's no longer just making statements and you walk away. So a number of organizations were formed. Most notable was SEATINI and Third World Network. People who follow again, who follow the WTO negotiations know the late Martin Cole. He was also a key thinker, a key person in the trade negotiations. So SEATINI and Third World Network were formed. And for Africa, SEATINI worked in Southern and Eastern Africa. And Third World Network Africa worked in West Africa and Central Africa. So that's how we carved out the continent. And Third World Network also had another office in Malaysia to work in Asia. So that's how these organizations came up. And SEATINI basically was formed to enhance the capacity of negotiators within Africa, also to decode. In fact, I remember yes talking about decoding, decoding the technical language in the trade agreements for people to understand what the agreement mean. So we could organize. SEATINI used to organize every 2 years. SEATINI would bring together negotiators in Eastern and Southern Africa, bring them together, look at, and also bring together the experts, Martin Cole, Ragavan, Eric Reinhardt, all those heavy names, bring them to Africa. Then they could start dissecting agreement per agreement, article per article. What does this mean? Why is EU position like this one? Why shouldn't we follow EU's position? And at the end of that meeting, that training, the negotiators would come up with their own positions, because the WTO, the ministerial conference, meets every 2 years. So every 2 years, our negotiators had a position, and they knew why they are saying no to a certain agreement, why they are saying no to a certain article. So that's how SEATINI was born.
Thank you, Jane, for that, I think, very important history where you highlighted the fundamental mission of one, building capacity of governments, ministries of trade, and the actual negotiators to engage in these discussions and conversations at the WTO. I can imagine for some that maybe were more familiar with having to navigate the annual meetings at the IMF and World Bank for many, many years. As you correctly noted, the WTO, as one said, was a new animal that also then required building capacity to understand that institution and the role that it was playing. Because as you also correctly said, they were doing things that were not just simply about trade, i.e. tariffs or exports or imports. They were looking at agreements that would actually impact the domestic economic policies, rules, and regulations of African societies. So I think that's a very fundamental piece of why building that capacity was so clear. Let me ask you also, just and this kind of segues into more contemporary work. Over that period of history, whether you're looking back or even assessing today, how would you say SEATINI's efforts to really build that capacity for the governments in Southern and Eastern Africa, how has that capacity, I guess, evolved or been built up over time? Are there some governments that maybe you have seen built up more capacity relative to others? Are there some countries where the negotiators really leaned in on the information and technical assistance that SEATINI was providing? I guess just sort of share any observations from that vantage point.
Okay, maybe what I want also to add on is that although we started with building capacity of trade negotiators, we expanded, capacity building to take into the policymakers. We really did a lot of work with the members of parliament, parliaments at national level, but also regional parliaments like the East African Legislative Assembly. Then we brought on board civil society because we knew that civil society should also be part of the global trade governance. And civil society, we brought on board even farmers, farmers, fisher folks, artisanal miners, everybody, because what we realized was whatever is agreed upon in the WTO has an implication on the livelihoods of the people. So the people must have a say. Looking back on our capacity building, because we generated a lot of information, we generated a lot of papers, policy briefings. What I have realized is that capacity building has to be continuous because from 1996 up to now, we have been building capacity, and we have seen negotiators, policymakers using the capacity we have built. I remember in the fifth ministerial conference in Cancun, the issue of the new issues, the so-called Singapore issues, had been on the table since 1996. Developed countries wanted to put on table issues of investment, competition policy, procurement, and trade facilitation. And the developing countries were saying, no, we want policy space to be able, for example, to direct investments where we want them. We want to use procurement to grow our economy. We want to use competition policy again to grow our private sector. So there had been a battle in the WTO whether the new issues should be put on the table for negotiations. And we did a lot of capacity building. And I remember what Yash told us was that issues in the WTO are presented upside down. That for procurement, they are saying that when you sign the procurement agreement, you are going to fight corruption in Africa. Yet what the reality is when you open up procurement, it's the private sector from outside who will take on all the contracts. So we are able, when we understood this about issues presenting upside down, that when you sign the investment agreement, it will help you to attract more investors instead of locking in your policy space to be able to direct investments to critical sectors. So we are able to build the capacity of our negotiators, of civil society, of members of parliament to say no to those new issues. And I remember in Cancun, we really contributed a lot for developing countries when they said, no, we are not signing those new issues, and the conference collapsed. So we have been contributing to building capacity, and we have seen our efforts really being rewarded. I can also give another example of the Economic Partnership Agreement. In 2002, the European Union wanted to negotiate the Economic Partnership Agreements with ACP, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, basically with their former colonies.
Correct.
So we looked at the agreement. There was nothing good for Africa, and we started a massive campaign. We had a no-stop EPA campaign globally, global campaign. And up to now, up to today, even in the East African community, it's only Kenya which has signed that agreement. And Kenya signed because of a very big stick, because Kenya is a developing country, and the European Union told them, if you don't sign it, we are going to tax your products entering the European Union. So Kenya signed, but the rest of East Africa, they haven't signed that agreement. So I can cite a number of examples where we have been able to build capacity, and where our capacity has been really used by the negotiators and policymakers. But what I have realized is that the terrain, the global terrain, is evolving, and also the people we train also get off the scene. When I look at Africa today, most of the trade negotiators who are part of our campaigns and capacity building, most of them have retired. So now there is a new crop of negotiators, and we need to continue. So it's continuation. We need to continue capacity building. And when we talk about the terrain which has changed, today we are talking about so many issues. We are talking about critical minerals. We are talking about climate change. We are talking about the debt, energy transition, and all these are impacting on our trade. So we need to understand those linkages and be able to craft a position that's good, that supports our structural transformation as Africa.
That's a very good segue, Jane, to where I wanted to go to, looking more at sort of the contemporary reality. But let's pause for a second to understand the past, but also a link to today, because you touched on a number of examples where there seemingly is repeated efforts to make the argument that the best way for African nations to build their economies is to, liberalize, open themselves up to more investment, or privatize, remove regulations, all those kinds of things. And if countries were to do all of those things per the recommendations, more growth, more development would happen. And it kind of always made me reflect on another kind of overarching narrative, in the sense that many people have argued over the last 20, 30 years that African nations and their economies are less developed because globalization has not come to the continent. In a sense, the argument is, which I call more of a narrative, that if Africa could only trade more with the rest of the world, African societies and their economies would have more growth and more development. I personally don't believe that having African economies to be trading more with the world is the solution to development and growth on the continent. Because in my opinion, the forces of globalization have also deeply impacted African economies. And the challenge is not that Africa's economies don't trade enough with the world. The challenge is the nature of what African economies do trade in the world, and the subsequent terms of what is traded with the world are actually more of structural challenges. And if you agree with that sort of position, then I think when you just noted, we now have a whole new energy transition, rare earths and critical minerals that are being tied to national security and geopolitics. You almost get the sense that even as new issues are overlaid into international trade, they oftentimes seem to start from that previous flawed premise that if only African economies traded more with the world, they would have more growth and development. And perhaps you might just want to either agree or disagree, share your view of it. But I think that's a good segue, because we'll talk more about some of the more contemporary issues that, as you said, the next generation of African trade negotiators or African trade ministers have to have sufficient capacity if they really want to have the system of global trade to have more of a positive development impact in African societies.
Yeah, Mark, I agree entirely. You are speaking to a converted disciple. And I remember Ias used to tell us that we are integrated in the global economy. Because when you read all these agreements, the bilateral agreements, the free trade agreements, which Africa is signing, they tell us that we want you to be integrated in the global economy. And I remember Yash always telling us we are integrated in the global economy, but we need to change the nature of that integration, and that's what we need to do, to change the nature of how we are integrated in the global economy, because we are at the bottom of the global value chain. Even that whole debate around global value chains, join the global value chains, at the end of the day, we are at the bottom of the global value chains. And you find where we were at end of colonialism, beginning of neo-colonialism. That's where we are. Uganda, when you talk about Uganda, it's coffee. We have added on gold. It's cocoa. It's tea. The same products. So that whole issue of saying that if we are trading more, we will grow our economies. What are we trading? So for me, I really agree with you that we need to change. In fact, our engagement in the global economic governance should be around that, how we can be able to change the way we are integrated in the global economy. And you raised those issues around liberalization, privatization, all these ideas which came with the structure adjustment programs. And for me, I think Africa is where we are because we followed to the letter. We followed those policies of liberalization, privatization, deregulation, free market economy. And for me, what really hurts me is that even when things are changing out there, sometimes you meet government officials, technocrats, who will tell you that no, we are integrated, we are liberalized. It's a private sector led. We have to, to liberalize. We have to open up. It's market forces. So it really hurts me that a number of people in key places in Africa haven't realized that we need a new development model. We have tested that model, the neoliberal model for a long time, and we have seen the results. But anyway, we need to do more capacity building, we need to do more conversations, so we have to do it.
Reflect, Jane, as you noted, the global trading system is changing. And not only are there new issues that are emerging, but also there does seem to be, how shall we say, a decline in the nature of the rules-based global trading system as more economies sort of turn to national security. Give me your sense in terms of the new environment, how you see the role of the free trade agreement for the African continent representing an alternative trade policy framework that could be more conducive for the role of trade to support development in African economies.
Okay. When you look at the current global trading system, it's in turmoil. The multilateral trading system has really been weakened, and there is a lot of unilateral measures. We have seen the Trump tariffs. We have seen the European Union also imposing climate-related trade measures like the deforestation regulations. So there is a lot of unilateralism. I remember when we were in Cameroon, Yaoundé, for the 14th ministerial conference. The US, because they wanted for the e-transmission moratorium to continue, because they don't want to pay taxes on e-transmissions. And that moratorium has been continuously, being every 2 years. This time, developing countries said no, and the US walked away. Like if it's either my way or I walk. So there's a lot of a lot of turmoil in the multilateral trading system, which is not really good. But for me, for Africa, I think it's really important because there is a reform agenda going on in the WTO. And I think African countries and developing countries should be part of those negotiations because we need, as Africa, a strong multilateral system, a multilateral system which can be able to adjudicate trade matters. We need it. For me, I have tested, I have seen the bilateral negotiations, the trilateral negotiations, the multilateral system is better. So we need to negotiate. On the table today, there is negotiations on reforming the WTO, and there are so many issues there that I think Africa should be on the table negotiating. But again, we need also to have a common position as Africa in the WTO. Today, even if we have the Africa group within the WTO, it's we. They are on different sides of the agenda. For example, some African countries, there is an agreement on investment. Some African governments are part of it, others are not part of it. So I think it's really important for Africa to have a common position when it comes to negotiating with third parties. And I remember the African Union had agreed on that since we have the CFTA, let us complete negotiating the CFTA, but we have seen a number of African countries negotiating third-party agreements. So for me, I think, one, we need a common position, a common agenda as Africa, a common voice as Africa, so that we can be able to negotiate from a position of strength as Africa. So for me, I'm calling Africa to do that, because also we have the CFTA. The more we negotiate different agreements, the more weaken the Continental Free Trade Area. And you talked about the alternative. For me, I think the Continental Free Trade Area is an alternative for Africa, so that we can be able to trade internally. It doesn't mean we won't trade with others, but we trade internally. We strengthen our trade, and then we strengthen our negotiations with the rest of the world.
Are there other examples in the global South, like in Asia, of nations being able to use trade and trade policy in ways that have been more supportive to their economic development?
Yeah, a number of countries have been able to do that. In fact, because you can't develop, a country can't develop without trading. Whatever little we have been trading. So you find countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, whatever we have been trading. And I think we would have been far better if the terms of trade are better, and if we can be able to add value to what we are trading, if we can be able to industrialize. But the challenge is that when you look at right from, I think, going back to history, right from slave trade to where we are today, the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world when it comes to trade has been extractive. It's just extracting, whether minerals, whether people, whether oil, whether cocoa, whether coal, it's extractivist. And we need to change that. But their countries, the little they have got out of trade, but we can do better. And I think for me, moving forward as Africa, we need to have alternatives, alternative policies, alternative thinking. We have talked about here all these policies of liberalization, deregulation, private sector led. I think as Africa, we need to sit and just analyze, synthesize what kind of policies can work for us. And by the way, as SEATINI, we have launched the Yashtandon Trade and Development Knowledge Hub. We have also launched the Afrocentric Trade and Development Policy Academy, just to do that. Maybe, Marc, we can talk about, for example, the issue of critical minerals. Today, everybody is talking about critical minerals. But for energy transition, for green industrialization, and we have, as Africa, we have many initiatives. We have the Africa Mining Vision, which we haven't implemented since 2009. We have so many strategies, but we haven't yet agreed what do we do with our minerals. Do we export them? I have seen DRC has put a export ban. So you put an export ban. What do you want? To add value to lithium, to make batteries? Yet today, China has a new technology which it has developed using sodium ions to make batteries. So these are issues which we need to discuss as Africa. That although we have lithium, we have cobalt, but technology is advancing so fast that at the end of the day, our minerals might be stranded minerals. What do we do now? We don't have the technology maybe to add value to these minerals. What do we do? And when we talk about critical minerals, critical for who? So we need also to analyze the criticality of minerals per our structural transformation. And when we do that, you might find clay, sand is more critical to us than cobalt and lithium. But all these we need to debate. We need to debate as Africa and agree. And when we agree, we go out there and negotiate with those third parties. So for me, I think that's what's missing out. Today, each country is being picked off one by one. I have seen the US, the MOU, the America First Global Health Strategy, telling Zambia, I give you health, you give me the minerals. Uganda, I give you health money, you want the data on health. And we need to debate that before we sign on that dotted line that we need the money for health. We need to look at what are we getting out of this money and what are we foregoing? Because, for example, when we give our health data, that means that our industry, when it comes to health, to pharmaceuticals, developing our own drugs, that's foreclosed. So these are the debates which we need to do, as Africa, and we hope our academy, because our academies are just that, just bringing minds together to debate, and be able to come up with a position which can help our negotiators, our policy makers, to be able to drive structural transformation on this continent.
No, those points are excellent, Jane. In fact, it's been documented here in the United States that there are a significant number of global pharmaceutical companies that when they have talked about developing future or next generation drugs, medicines, and compounds, the one thing that they need the most are the medical data and genetic information from the African continent. that they have noted that
because
is
that's where the population is.
Exactly. It is not a coincidence that we see these proposals for, we give you this, but in return, we want access to the health data of your citizens. They know how valuable the health data of African citizens will be to future pharmaceutical products and compounds in the world.
Exactly. And I remember Yash used to tell us there are no free lunches. Somebody says, I'm taking you for lunch. You ask, what do you want?
Yes, very true. I know we have a little bit more time. I wanted to ask another question because there's a big debate going on in the international community these days about the question of China's role and emergence in the global economy. Earlier, Jane, you mentioned the importance for African nations to have alternatives. And I think for many, having an alternative to Europe or an alternative to America, could involve, working with China or doing trade with China. How do you see some of the, I guess, positive things, but maybe also challenges in Africa's trade relationships with China as the role of China in the world, particularly in terms of industry, continues to expand?
Okay. There are so many um, positions when it comes to China, especially China in Africa. But for me, I really think that one, I think there is a lot for Africa to learn from China. The way China has been able to develop, there is a lot to learn. There is also a position, people saying that China is dumping their things in Africa, which is
Mm-hmm.
true. But I think the onus is on us as Africa to be able to put in place, there are tools which we can be able to use. We can use tariffs. Those tools are still there, to be able to say, don't bring that, don't bring your plastics, don't bring that. I see Chinatowns everywhere, but we allow them to come. I see China retailers, they bring shoes, they do what, and I say, where is our investment policy? So we need a strong investment policy to be able to direct China or any other investor to certain sectors. Why should you allow a Chinese to come and sell 2 or 3 pairs of shoes? So for me, I think dealing with China, we need to strengthen our own legal frameworks to be able to direct China to where I want them to go. Another issue is the issue of indebtedness. China has gone into infrastructure, but I have seen even the way we negotiate infrastructure debts and contracts. It's like they are doing us a favor, yet they are not. They give us the loans, we give them the contracts, even the cement, the iron bars, everything, even the workers. So whose problem is that? It's our problem. We need to negotiate better. So for me, I think whether it's China, whether it's EU, whether it's US, we need to strengthen our legal frameworks. We need to negotiate better. So for me, it's not China or whatever. It's the way we are dealing with third parties. We are very lenient. We don't care as Africa what's dumped here. We need to develop some more teeth, and some more muscle when we are dealing with third parties. And I think we still think that maybe somebody to trade with you, it's charity. It's not. And we have been saying as SEATINI that we need a win-win-win-win. Win for Africa, win for the investors, win for the people the people as farmers, as artisanal miners, as fisher folks, and win for our environment. All those people have to win. So any agreement we sign, whether with China, whether with US, whether with EU, whether with India, we need to have that test. Are they winning? Are we winning? Is the environment winning? Are the people winning?
Now, I think, Jane, that is a very effective way of framing the nature of these international relationships. As you correctly noted, African governments and societies and other stakeholders have to have agency. And as you said, they have to be able to negotiate and be firm as to the outcomes that are desired. And as you correctly said, these outcomes need to be a win for the natural environment, a win for the citizens of the society where the investment is coming to, a win for the economy. And if someone's going to invest, obviously as an investor, they should be able to get a return on their investment, so to speak. But you can imagine agreements that only do the latter, only offer the return for the investor, but don't offer wins for the environment, don't offer a win for the citizens in total. That's probably not going to be an agreement that supports structural transformation of the society.
Exactly.
Well, Jane, I want to then thank you so much for allowing me to have this conversation with you. It's really been an honor, and it does bring me back to, as I said at the outset, many fond memories of working with Yash and others who you mentioned over 25 years ago. And needless to say, as you correctly pointed, the global environment is changing. We're African governments are going to need a new generation of negotiators and ministers who have the capacity to understand the current global trading system, things that are positive about it, things that are not so positive about it, to then, as you said, try to negotiate agreements that are mutually beneficial, but particularly beneficial for African society. So again, I want to wish you all the best in your work, and I look forward to collaborating in the future whenever possible with the academies, for example, that you mentioned. I would love to be able to support that kind of work for the next generation of African negotiators.
Thank you so much.